Hey everybody, welcome back to our second week in our Evidence of Easter series. Easter is just a few weeks away, and Easter is, for Christians, it's the celebration of Jesus' resurrection. And Easter is the singular reason that you either should or shouldn't be a follower of Jesus. Because if you look back, it was the resurrection, not Jesus' teachings, not Jesus' miracles, not even his death on the cross. It was his resurrection that caused his earliest followers to follow him. That is what convinced them, and I believe it's what should convince you and me to follow Jesus as well. Because if the resurrection never happened, then Jesus isn't God. But if the resurrection did happen, then Jesus really is God, and you and I should dedicate our entire lives to following him. Now, if you missed last week, I'd encourage you to go back and watch that message. But to kind of catch up to speed, Jesus, the Easter story, he's having the worst day of his life. And just when we think it couldn't get any worse, he's betrayed by two of his closest friends and then arrested by the religious leaders. And that's where we pick up our story today. We're in Luke chapter 22. And here's where the story picks up. It says, the guards in charge of Jesus, so he's arrested by these guards. It says that the guards in charge of Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and said, "Prophesy to us, who hit you this time?" And they hurled all sorts of terrible insults at him. Now, how horrible of a human being do you have to be to put a bag over someone's head, punch him in the face, and say, "Who hit you?" Right? Like, that's messed up. You have to be a horrible person, right? Or maybe not. I mean, think about the horrible things that have happened throughout history. I mean, what caused Christians during the Crusades to go around murdering people for not becoming a Christian? What caused literally an entire nation's army to arrest and kill millions of Jews in Nazi Germany? I mean, even today, what causes American federal agents to capture and torture terrorists to just try to get information? I mean, it seems like anybody can do this. Because what happens in all of these is that we know we're doing the wrong thing, but we believe that we're doing it for the right reasons. And that is exactly what we're going to see play out today as we dig into the resurrection of Jesus. What comes next is a series of events of people in power who know what they're doing is the wrong thing, but they believe that they're doing it for the right reasons. So let me just give you a quick kind of picture of what happens next. So all of these religious leaders, they arrest Jesus. After questioning Jesus, they try to convict him, and they believe that Jesus said that he's the Messiah, that he's the Savior, right? Jesus said he's God. He's the person that these religious leaders have been waiting for years, hundreds of years. But they don't want Jesus to be the guy they were waiting for. And so they try to get him arrested. So they capture Jesus, they convict him of this, and they bring him to a guy named Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor at the time. Now, if you've heard the Easter story, maybe you've heard of Pontius Pilate before. So he's the governor, and they bring him to Pilate. And they bring Jesus to Pilate, and they don't say, "Hey, this guy claims he's God." Because that's not going to do anything. So instead what they do is they lie and try to manipulate Pontius Pilate. What they do is they tell him, well, Jesus is claiming to be king. Jesus is telling people not to pay their taxes. Jesus is trying to cause an insurrection. He's trying to have people rise up and overthrow the government. And that's what they try to convince Pilate that Jesus is doing. But Pilate is a politician, okay? Like you and I, like we know right now, we're in the middle of an election year. And kind of in a similar way, like all these people are campaigning, Pilate was always in campaigning mode. Because if he could get enough people to like him, if he could get enough people to cheer him on, he would raise in power, that he would get elected and rise to bigger levels of authority and bigger levels of power. His political career would grow. And so Pilate, he looks at this case and he says, this is silly. right? I'm not going to waste my time on this whole Jesus issue you guys are bringing up. So instead of trying to waste his time there, because no matter what he decides with Jesus, some people are going to be upset and he's going to lose influence. So instead, Pilate finds a loophole and he sends Jesus over to another politician, a guy named Herod. Now, Pilate and Herod don't like each other. So this is kind of Pilate's also way of like, yeah, Herod, I don't like you, you deal with this. Now, to give you like a little bit of history on who this Herod guy is, the way like history talks about him is he's kind of like the equivalent of a drunken frat boy trying to be a celebrity. Like that's who Herod is. He's just kind of a turd of a guy. I mean, he throws these big parties where people just get drunk for days on end. He has, sleeps around with all of these people and he throws these massive parties and he just doesn't take his job seriously. I mean, he's a politician, he has power, and he just kind of uses that power to entertain himself. And in comes Jesus. So Jesus comes in, and Herod has heard about Jesus. He's heard rumors about Jesus' miracles and all these other things that Jesus has done. So Herod asks Jesus, he says, okay, you're here, do a miracle for me. Entertain me, right? Herod questions Jesus and mocks Jesus, and he tries to make this big show of Jesus, but the whole time Jesus stands there and does nothing, says nothing. So Herod kind of gets sick of it. He gets bored with Jesus, and he ends up sending Jesus back to Pontius Pilate. And there's this interesting little nugget that happens here, because in Luke 23, verse 12, it says, Herod and Pilate, who had been enemies before, became friends that day. I love this, because there's something about this ridiculous situation with Jesus that Pilate looks at this, and Herod looks at this, and they both go, this is ridiculous. We have this in common. And they gain a friendship over this religious bickering happening back and forth. And why this fascinates me is because, let's just be honest, if you're not a church person, if you're not a Christian, if you've kind of experienced church and walked away from church, it's probably because you've looked at church people and they bicker about stupid things. They argue about meaningless things. That as somebody from the outside looking in, you see a bunch of Christians who just are petty with each other. And that's exactly what Pilate and Herod see with this whole Jesus situation. But to pick up the story, Herod sends Jesus back to Pilate. So Pontius Pilate now has Jesus in front of him. He says Jesus is not guilty of any of this stuff, okay? Jesus is innocent. And just when Pilate is ready to release Jesus, the crowd isn't having it. So here's where the story picks up. In Luke chapter 23, it says, then a mighty roar rose from the crowd with one voice, and they shouted, kill him and release Barabbas to us. Now I love, there's a little side note that explains who this random Barabbas character is. It says, Barabbas was in prison for taking part in an insurrection in Jerusalem against the government and for murder, right? So it's kind of this like side note. Hey, this is a guy that actually was convicted of trying to overthrow the government. Oh, and by the way, he's also a murderer, right? He's in jail for the very thing that they're trying to convict Jesus of, but he's also a murderer. So it goes on, it says, Pilate argued with them because he wanted to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, crucify him, crucify him. Now, to give you a little backdrop of why this is all going on. Pilate's a politician, right? He just wants to gain the favor of all the people. He wants to rise in the ranks of his political career. So one of the things that he does is he begins this tradition around the Jewish holiday Passover. And what the tradition is every time on this day during Passover, he releases a Jewish prisoner back to the Jewish people, right? This is his way of like, oh, I'll have pity on you, right? Like, look at me, look at how good I am. You can have one of your people back. So he creates this tradition. And now, Pilate has this plan. He looks at Jesus and says, he's not guilty, and they want me to arrest him. I'll just release him back to the crowd. But the crowd says, no, we would rather have Barabbas, this guy who actually did try to overthrow the government, who actually is guilty of murder. They would rather have him be released than Jesus. That the religious leaders in that area were so bent on getting Jesus killed that they rallied the whole crowd around them, to shout, crucify him, release Barabbas to us, and kill Jesus. So here's how the story goes on. It says, for the third time, Pilate demanded, why? What crime has Jesus committed? I have found no reason to sentence him to death. So I will have him flogged, and then I will release him. Now, it says that he's going to have him flogged. What is that? Now, you got to remember, right? Pilate is trying to get the crowd back on his side. He's trying to get all of these religious people to like him. So they don't want Pilate to just release Jesus back to them. So Pilate says, well, maybe I'll make Jesus suffer. I won't kill him, but I'll make him suffer. I'm going to flog him. So what is flogging? What flogging is how this would work is that they would take a prisoner, right? And the whole idea behind this is they want to shame the prisoner, but they also want to instill fear in everyone else that's watching. So they would invite these crowds to come watch this thing. So they'd take a prisoner and they'd strip them naked, right? Embarrass them, humiliate them. They would take the prisoner, strip them naked, and then chain them to like the wall or the floor or like a big stone in this giant, large, open area where a whole crowd could gather and watch this. And while they were chained, what would happen is a Roman soldier would come around with a whip. Now, this is my cheesy little prop whip, right? We all know what a whip is, right? Like we know what whips are. But the Roman guard wouldn't come around with a whip. They would come around with what was called a cat o' nine tails. Now, essentially what that was a whip, but instead of one tail, there would be 9 of these tails, all coming out from the same whip. Now, what this Roman soldier would do then is whip the person with this cat o' nine tails. But you got to understand that this wasn't just a whip, but on each of the 9 tails in this whip, there would be little metal ball bearings or rocks or stones attached somewhere on each of the tails. And what would happen is that as they would whip a person, these rocks, these stones would hit the person's back, they'd hit the person's flesh. And if you've ever if you like cooking, or if you ever watch cooking shows, you've maybe seen this, that you'll take chicken or steak and you'll hit it with a hammer, and they call it tenderizing the meat. And the same idea is happening here. That they added these rocks, these metal ball bearings to each of the tails to tenderize the flesh. Every time they would whip, it would hit the prisoner's body, and it would tenderize the flesh. Because at the very end of each of these 9 tails, they would attach pieces of glass or hooks. And so as the flesh would get tenderized, eventually the glass would sink in, the hooks would sink in. The way historians talk about flogging is that Roman soldiers would get so good at this that they would whip the person, and instead of just whipping it and pulling it back, they'd whip them and give it a little bit of tug to make sure all the hooks and everything sank in to the flesh. Then they'd pull it out. One historian writes an account of a flogging that was happening where when they were whipping it, a hook got so deep into the flesh that when they pulled, it literally ripped a guy's rib straight out of his body. This was brutal, that people around would watch as entertainment, but it would be the Roman soldiers' way of instilling fear in everyone else, to say, you fall in line, or this is what happens. Now, the Roman soldiers, they would whip the prisoner, in this case Jesus, 39 times. Why 39? It's a random number. It sounds weird, right? But what it was this was such a brutal form of torture. It was such a gruesome thing that the Roman Empire, they put a cap on it. They said, you can only whip someone 40 times. You can only flog someone 40 lashes. And anything more than that, it's too much. It's going too far. It's too gruesome. It's too brutal. And so a Roman soldier, if you were to lose count and whip somebody 41 times, you would be found guilty. And now you would be attached to the stone or to the floor. You'd be chained there, and you would receive those 40 lashings. So what the Roman soldiers did is they would cut that number down to 39. Because that way, if they lost count and whipped them one extra time, they would still only get 40 lashes. This is what flogging was. So when it says, and Jesus was flogged, that's what happened. So Pilate looks at the crowd and he says, I will flog him. And if you look at other books, the book of Matthew or the book of Mark, it talks about how he actually did this to Jesus. And Pilate's thought was, if I can do this form of torture, if I can flog Jesus, then they won't make me kill him, right? I can flog him, release him, everyone's happy because now Jesus is released, those people are happy, Jesus was flogged, so now those people are happy, everyone's happy, and I win. Except that's not what happens. Pilate flogs Jesus, and he comes back, and this is how the crowd responds. It says, but the mob shouted louder and louder, demanding that Jesus be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate sentenced Jesus to die as they demanded. And as they had requested, Pilate released Barabbas, the man in prison for insurrection and murder. But he turned Jesus over to them to do as they wished. Now, I read the story, and what's fascinating to me is that when Jesus first showed up on Pilate's doorstep, Pilate was just going to set him free. He had no intention of hurting, harming, or killing Jesus. He thought this was ridiculous. But Pilate is a politician, and he knew that it would be bad for him to just let him go because that's not what the crowd wanted. And so instead, Pilate does the very thing that he knows is wrong, but justifies doing it for the right reasons. That once again, what we see here is Pilate does the wrong thing for the right reasons. And it's the same thing that we talked about earlier, that we all do this. We all justify doing the wrong thing for the right reasons, even though we know doing the wrong thing for the right reasons is always wrong. We know this, but if we're just honest with ourselves, we all do this, don't we? I mean, think about it. We all tear people down. We post things online that are hurtful or even hateful towards certain people. And we know it's wrong, but we do it for the right reasons, right? We do it because that's just me being me, or I'm just trying to get other people to laugh. It's just a joke, right? I'm doing it for the right reasons. Or you know, I'm going to go, and even though I'm underage, I'm still going to drink, right? I'll still sleep around with people, and well, you know, I'm just experimenting. I'm just having fun, right? Nobody's getting hurt. I know it's wrong, but I'm going to do it for the right reasons. And yet we all know that doing the wrong thing for the right reasons is still wrong. So what does any of this have to do with the resurrection, right? This is about evidence of Easter. What does this have to do with the resurrection? Well, if the resurrection never happened, then Jesus isn't God. We know that, right? And if Jesus isn't God, there is no obligation to follow any of his teachings, right? I mean, if Jesus isn't God, he has no authority over our lives. That everything that Jesus said about loving God or loving our neighbors or loving our enemies, everything that Jesus said about not cheating people or ripping people off, everything that Jesus said about being generous or returning evil with good or going to make disciples, if Jesus isn't God, we don't have to follow any of that. If the resurrection never happened, we're not obligated to any of that. But if the resurrection did happen, then Jesus really is God. And if Jesus really is God, then everything that he taught, everything he said, is a value that followers of Jesus need to live out. That if the resurrection really happened, then doing the wrong thing, even for the right reasons, is never okay. It's never okay for a follower of Jesus, no matter the cost. Back when I was in school, in middle school, high school, and you guys probably have the same thing too. In college, I would get a student ID. Now, this is my driver's license, but let's pretend, okay? You guys get your student IDs, and we'd get our student IDs too, as well. And I don't know if you know this, but there are places where you can use your student ID to get serious discounts, right? Movie theaters, different restaurants, different stores, that if you have a student ID, you can get some discounts. And let me tell you, as a high schooler, as a college kid, that's what I did. I took advantage of that like crazy because you know this, high schoolers are broke. When you're in college, you're broke. You have no money. So any kind of discount that you can get, you go get it. Well, after I graduated from college, I still had my student ID. And so I would still use it. Even though I wasn't a student, I was still broke. And I wasn't just broke now, I also had a crazy amount of student debt. So I was even more broke than I had previously been. And so to me, I would justify, I would just use my student ID to get discounts. Well, one day I was with a group of friends and I'm telling them, hey, I'm getting my discounts, I know, but whatever, I'm using my student ID, I went to the movies, got like half price tickets, it was awesome. And a friend of mine was there, Deb, and she turned to me and she said 3 words that changed who I was. She turned to me and she said, everyday choices, Brian. And that's it. But you see, it was in that moment I knew exactly what she was saying. That every time, even in the little things, that I chose to do the wrong thing for the right reason, it was moving me to become less and less like Jesus. That every time I chose to do the wrong thing for the right reasons, I became less and less the person that I wanted to become. And from that day on, I stopped using my student ID. The reason I'm showing you my actual ID instead of my student ID is because I threw it away. And from that day forward, I started paying full price. And was it hard? Yeah. But it changed me. I started to learn how to manage money better. Not only did I start paying full price for everything, it also got me to the point where I realized I was getting discounts because I was broke. I needed help. And the people around me were facing the same situation. They were broke and they needed help. And as I grew in my ability to manage money, I started to help other people out. I started to pay for their lunch. I started to pay for their coffee. I started to pay for their movie ticket. And I started blessing other people. I started to become generous. That over time, I saw God start to transform me where money no longer had control over my life. I started to become more generous. And as I started to become more generous, I started to give money to missionaries and other ministries that needed help financially. And I wanted to be a blessing to them. And over time, I started to tithe and give money back to my church because I knew the ministry here was worth it. And over time, I became a generous person. And over time, I stopped being a taker and I started being a giver. And what I know for certain is that if the resurrection never happened, I would still be cheating people. I would still be cutting corners. I would still be taking instead of giving. You see, what the resurrection shows us is that we have a God who cares deeply about us. We have a God who is alive and is in the transformation business. That he's not calling us to follow him because we like his teachings. He's calling us to follow him because he leads us to life. That we don't have to try to justify doing the wrong things for the right reasons, because following him, following his heart, following his teachings, following his love will always lead us to doing the right things. And even when it costs us dearly, we will be transformed to become the kind of people who transform the world around us. That's what the resurrection tells us. If the resurrection isn't real, if it never happened, then Jesus isn't God, and he cannot transform us. He can't transform you. But if the resurrection did happen, if it really is real, then Jesus really is God. And if Jesus really is God, then you and I should dedicate our entire lives to following him, because only he can lead us into life. Today, if you're here and you are not a follower of Jesus, maybe you are one of those people who you've experienced church and you're just kind of sick of the bickering. You're sick of all the infighting, and you just walked away. Tonight, today, in this moment, would you consider trying Jesus again? Would you consider with me that maybe the resurrection did happen? And if it did happen, then Jesus really is God. And even though people like me don't always get it right? Even though as Christians, I've been part of the problem, maybe you really do have a God that is inviting you into something bigger, into something better, and that he really does want to transform your life. If you're here and you're not a follower of Jesus, I want to invite you to cross that line of faith and to surrender your life to Jesus, to become a follower of not Jesus' teachings, of not Jesus' miracles, of not Jesus' death on the cross, but to become a follower of the resurrected Jesus who gives life today. If that's you, I want to invite you to pray a simple prayer that says, Jesus, I give you my life. And from this day forward, you would choose to follow him with all of your life.